Again, it's good to be with you this morning. I'm going to go a little bit off track today. We've been studying about the New Testament Christian for the past couple of months. We're just getting ready to go into our next month, so I just pulled something out that kind of something different that we can go over. If you have your Bibles, turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 4. 1 Corinthians chapter 4, and we just simply want to read verse number 2. And this is where we will begin this morning. Paul, again, in writing to the Corinthians, would say, moreover, it is required. Okay, when he states that word required, that means it's an imperative, it's a must. This is something that has to happen. It is required in stewards that a man be found faithful. We need to be found faithful in our stewardship of the things that we're made stewards of here upon this earth. You know, we can look at several things. You know, we need to be good stewards of our time. We need to be good stewards of our talents. But this morning, what we want to look at, we want to be good stewards, faithful stewards of our physical blessings that God gives us here upon this earth. Now, a lot of people, you know, when we start talking about being stewards of our physical blessings, a lot of them get up there and they say, well, here we go with the preacher again. He wants to get my pocketbook. You know, the problem is that this is a biblical subject. You know, one of the commentaries that I read leading up to this in my studies this week is that besides love, the concept of giving and being stewards of our physical blessings is probably mentioned just about as much as love is here in the scriptures. And so it is a biblical subject. You know, when you think about love, you know, we know that the gospel that God has given us, the gospel is love. Okay? But how do we know that? You ever think about that? How do you know that the gospel is a gospel of love? Well, in John chapter 3 and verse number 16, I want you to notice, and this is a familiar verse to most of us. Okay? We learn it as children and we quote it and things, but notice what Jesus actually says. Here in John chapter 3, he says, for God so loved the world. Okay, now Jesus just stopped there and just say, okay, this is the way it is, so you just believe it. No, he didn't. He didn't. God tells us that he loves the world, yes, but then he tells us, or not tells us, but he shows us how much. He gives an example, if you will, to show mankind how much he loves us. Okay? He would go on to say there, for he, what? Gave his only begotten Son. When we express, well, God, let me put it back into context. When God expressed his love to mankind, it was in the aspect of his giving that God expressed his love to mankind. And this is what we need to understand. We would be very amiss to talk about we say we love God. Yeah, I love God, and all these people out in the world, yeah, I love God. Well, what's your expression to God in that love? One of the ways that we express our love to God is in our giving, in our stewardship of our physical blessings here upon this earth. And as Paul pointed out there in 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse number 2, we need to be found faithful, being stewards of those physical blessings. Now, there's 4 points I want to look at this morning as we discuss this, being stewards of our physical blessing. The first one we want to understand and look at to help us to better be stewards of our physical blessings is that of divine ownership. Divine ownership. Back in the book of Psalms, in Psalm number 50, I always want to try and say Psalm number 50 and not chapter, because there's no chapters in the Psalms, they're just Psalms. So Psalm number 50. We want to look at verses 10 through 12. Here David would write, for every beast of the forest is what? Mine. Now, this is the Lord. This is David stating what the Lord says. Every beast of the forest is mine, and the cattle upon 1,000 hills. I know all the fowls in the mountains and the wild beasts of the field. They are mine. What's God saying? Basically, this is divine ownership. God owns everything. You recall back in Genesis chapter 1, what did it say in that very first chapter of our scriptures? It would say, in the beginning, who created everything? God. So by God creating everything, He owns everything to begin with. It's not ours. But notice verse number 12 as David continues. It would say, talking about God, if I were hungry, I don't think that God gets hungry. But if God did get hungry, notice what he says. I would not tell you. I wouldn't tell my creation that I'm hungry. Okay? Why? For the world is mine. I don't need you. Basically what God, I already own it. I already own it. It's mine. And the fullness thereof. Okay? Even if God was hungry, He wouldn't ask us for anything because we don't own anything. We don't have anything that we can give Him in order to satisfy that. I know in a certain sense that I can sit there and say that where I live, up there in Barefoot Bay, that's my house. Okay? I live there, I pay the bills and everything else. So in a certain sense, I can understand that. But we need to, as His children, and speaking of the divine attribute of divine ownership, if you will, we need to sit back and understand that in the truest sense, that house that I'm living in, it doesn't really belong to me. It belongs to God. The car that I drive each and every day, it really doesn't belong to me. It's basically on loan from God. God's given it to me because I have His love and His grace. Look back in Job chapter 41 and verse number 11. Job chapter 41 and verse number 11. I think I went too far. Yeah, I did. Job chapter 41 and verse number 11. This is one of those great chapters in which Job is there and he's been questioning why all these things are happening to him, and it finally got to the point where he seems to be questioning God, and God comes back and He starts just hurling question after question. Job, were you there when I did this? When you there? And basically the point being that God was making to Job is, why are you questioning me, what I've done? Can you do all these things that I have done? You don't know what you're talking about, Job. But notice in verse number 4, chapter 41 and verse number 11, he would say, who hath prevented me that I should repay him? Whatsoever is under the whole heaven is mine. The American Standard Version of 1901 has it, who hath first given unto me? Who's given something to me, God is saying to Job, that I should repay him? What have you or anybody else given to me that I should repay him? There is absolutely nothing that anybody has given. Why is that? Whatsoever is under the whole heaven is mine. There's nothing that we can give to God because He already owns it. This is the attribute of divine ownership. God owns everything. Point number 2 that we can go to. Well, no. Let me look at one more scriptural reference here. I almost forgot about this. Go to 1 Chronicles. 1 Chronicles, chapter 29. And we'll begin reading in beginning probably here. Let me just make sure. In verse number 1, okay, just to get some context into what David's talking about. He would say, furthermore, David the king said unto all the congregation, Solomon my son, whom alone God hath chosen, is yet younger and tender, and the work is great, for the palace is not for man, but for the Lord. What David is talking about is God basically is giving commission to his son Solomon, to build the temple. To build the temple. You recall David wasn't allowed to do that because David had blood on his hands from all the war they went through. God wouldn't let him do that. So it's now been passed on to Solomon. He would go on to say, Now I have prepared with all my might for the house of my God the gold of things that are to be made of gold, and the silver of things of silver, and the brass of things of brass, and the iron of things of iron, the wood of things of wood, onyx stones and stones to be set, glistening stones in diverse colors, and all manner of precious stones, and marbles, stones, in abundance more. Moreover, because I have set my affection on the house of my God, I have of my own proper good of gold and silver, which I have given to the house of God, over and above all that I have prepared for the holy house. Okay, David's talking about giving of all these things so that Solomon has the materials to build the house of God. Okay, that's what we're talking about. And as he goes through here and he talks about the things that the nation of Israel also gave. Everybody was giving so that Solomon could build that wonderful temple. Now go down to verse number 10. Verse number 10. He says, "Wherefore David blessed the Lord before all the congregation, and David said, Blessed be thou, Lord God of Israel our Father, forever and ever." Okay. David's now going to God in prayer. Okay, this is a prayer of thanksgiving for what's been assembled to build the tabernacle or the temple. "Thine, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty, for all that is in the heaven and earth is thine." Again, that concept of divine ownership. "Thine is the kingdom, O Lord, and thou art exalted as head above all. Both riches and honor come of thee, and thou reignest over all. And in thy hand is power and might, and in thy hand it is to make great, and to give strength unto all. Now therefore, our God, we thank thee, and praise thy glorious name." Notice verse number 14. "But who am I, and what is my people, that we should be able to offer so willingly after this sort?" Who am I that we're able to do all this, to give all this stuff so we can build the temple? Notice what he says. "For all things come of thee." Who am I that I'm not giving of myself? I'm not giving of something that I own, is basically what David is expressing here, because it already comes from God. It's already God's. "Of thine own have we given thee." All those wonderful things to build the temple, David is making the statement, it's not mine, it's yours. We're basically giving it back to you. Divine ownership. God owns everything. The second thing that we need to understand in the stewardship of our physical blessings is the concept of human endowment or entrustment. This is really the proper definition of what a steward is. You know, a steward is somebody that works for somebody else, and the master is sitting there saying, okay, this is my goods. I'm going to entrust you to do what I want you to do with them. That's what it means to be a steward, to be entrusted with something that is not yours. And so you go off and you use it as the master would see fit for you to use it. It's not up to you. This is what the master wants you to use, and that's really the definition, human endowment or entrustment of these things. In James chapter 1 and verse number 17, a verse that we're familiar with, but I just want to go back over it just a little bit here. James is right, "Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, and cometh down from the Father of lights, with whom is no variableness, neither shadow of turning." God is the Father of lights. Okay? There is no variableness in His giving. God is unchangeable. He does not change. God doesn't have bad days in which He tempts people. Rather, He consistently gives good gifts. Okay. God gives good things on a consistent basis. There is no turning, he would express. As consistent as the heavenly bodies are, they do exhibit changes as man perceives them. Seasonal variations, there are eclipses, there's phases of the moon, clouded skies, sunshine, the shifting shadows seen hourly on a sundial. All these things change here in the universe. But God's character and nature are unchanging. He does not shift from good given to occasional evil giving. Everything that God gives is good. Doesn't matter what it is. God does not change. Look back in Acts chapter 14. Acts chapter 14, verses 16 and 17. Here Paul is preaching there in the city of Lystra. And he makes some interesting comments to those. Now, in the city of Lystra, they were Gentiles. They were part of the Gentiles that Paul went out to preach to. He would say there, beginning in verse number 16, talking about God, who in times past suffered all nations to walk in their own ways. That reminds me of what Paul would write back to there in Romans chapter 1. I'll just go back there real quick. Hold your place there in Acts chapter 14. In Romans chapter 1, what Paul said about the Gentiles. Let's see here. Yeah, in verse number 28 of Romans chapter 1. Here Paul is talking about the Gentiles and how they've rejected God. They started worshiping the creation instead of the Creator. He'd say, even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, okay? But notice this, God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient. Okay, and then he begins to list those things that they were doing. Be filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whispers, backbiters, haters of gods, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, all these things. This is what God gave them over to do those things that were not right. That's what he's talking about. When we go back to Acts chapter 14, he would say, who in verse number 16, who in times past suffered all nations to walk in their own ways. The Gentiles wanted to do all those things. I'll let them do it. They wanted to be unrighteous. They wanted to commit fornication. They wanted to hate each other, hate me. Said they were haters of God. Okay? But notice, nevertheless, verse number 17, even though God allowed them to do this, nevertheless, He left Himself not without witness, notice this, in that He did good. God did good to them and gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts and food with food and gladness. Hearts and food with gladness. I got a quote here from H. Leo Boyles in his commentary. It's really interesting what he had to say about what was going on here. It says, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness. Okay? The results of such blessings are that human needs are met and men and women are joyful and happy. That's what he's talking about. Even the unbeliever, the atheist, the one that shakes his hand to God and says, I don't believe, or even the ones that, like it said back there in Romans, haters of God, I hate you, God. Notice, they cannot even be happy without God in their situation. For he or she depends upon God's earthly blessings for happiness. Thus it is hypocritical for the well-fed atheist to lecture on why man does not need God. The illustration is given of a child, and they're waiting at a bus station, and the father's there in the chair, and the little child she's just sitting there and she's screaming at her dad. I hate you, Daddy. She's slapping her dad. She's biting on her dad, and her dad's just sitting there and he's just taking it. And you're looking at this all happening, and there's one thing that you notice. All the time that this child is doing that, she's sitting on the father's knee. She's sitting on the father's knee. The dad is supporting her all the time that this child is railing upon him. That's what people in the world do. God gives them each and every day food to fill their bellies, to make them happy, and then they turn around and they yell at God, I hate you. That's hypocritical. He even gives good gifts to those who are evil. Look in 1 Timothy chapter 6. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 17 through 19. Again, we're talking about human endowment, understanding that God gives, even giving these good gifts to those who are evil. Okay, but say there here in 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse number 17, say, charge them that are rich in this world, okay, that they be not high-minded, nor trust in uncertain riches, okay, instead of doing those things, okay, but in the living God who giveth us richly all things to enjoy. He's talking to us by application today. He's not sitting there saying that money's evil. We see that. It's not a sin to be rich. But what we're coming to an understanding is of how we use those riches. Okay, God has given us richly all things to enjoy. Why? That they do good. Here's that human endowment. God has given us these things all to enjoy. Now here's our entrustment of what we're supposed to do with those things. To do good. That they be rich in good works. Good works. This is what we're supposed to do with those blessings. This is what stewardship is. God is entrusting us with the things that He has given us to do good, ready to distribute, willing to communicate. Okay? This suggests a willingness to give. A willingness to give. Back in Deuteronomy chapter 8, even back in the Old Testament and under the law of Moses, this principle of giving and doing good was there. Again, beginning of Deuteronomy chapter 8 and verse number 6. Say, therefore thou shalt keep the commandments of the Lord thy God, to walk in his ways and to fear him. For the Lord thy God bringeth thee into a good land. Now this is by the hand of God. The land of brooks of water, the fountains and depths that spring out of the valleys and hills, the land of wheat and barley and vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of oil, olive and honey, a land wherein thou shalt eat bread without scarceness. Thou shalt not lack anything in it, a land whose stones are iron, and out of whose hills thou mayest dig brass. When thou hast eaten and art full, then thou shalt bless the Lord thy God for the good land which he hath given thee. That's the way it's supposed to be. We understand that God has given us these things. We need to continually understand that. But notice verse number 11. He would say, beware that thou forget not the Lord thy God, in not keeping his commandments and his judgments and his statutes which I command thee this day. Okay. Even though we've been blessed with all these wonderful physical things here upon this earth, it can be a curse. We need to understand that. And here's the curse. Lest thou hast eaten and art full, and hast built goodly houses and dwelt therein, and when thy herds and thy flocks multiply, and the silver and thy gold be multiplied, and all that has multiplied, then thy heart be lifted up, and thou forget the Lord thy God. How many people have done that today? You ever hear the phraseology, it's all mine? I've worked hard for this, it's mine. It's not yours. These people went through and they plowed the fields, they watered the crops and everything else. But everything comes from God. We are just entrusted with these things, and we should never forget that. So many people think about the physical blessings of this life and they say, it's all on me, it's all mine. I've worked hard for this and I should be able to use it how I see fit. That's not the way the Christian needs to look at his physical blessings. We understand that it's come from God, and therefore I need to be a good steward, and now God's entrusted me with this. Now I need to use it and be faithful in that use. So we see the concept of divine ownership. We see that of human endowment or human entrustment. The third thing that we want to look at this time now is faithful administration. Belongs to God. He's entrusted it with us. Now what do I do with it in my life is what we're saying. Back in Luke chapter 16, there's a parable that our Lord teaches here. And I'll be honest with you, a lot of commentaries, and it's taken me a lot of thought. What this parable that Jesus teaches is probably the most difficult parable to understand. I don't think it needs to be that way if we'll keep a couple of things in mind as we look at it. I've read a lot of commentaries on it, and a couple of the things that I first see is that we want to try to attribute persons to the individuals in the parable. Now, a lot of times we can do that. I'm not arguing we can't do that. What I am arguing is that we need to be careful when we do it. Because sometimes it doesn't warrant trying to assign individuals to the people in the parable, Jesus or whoever. And that's one of the problems that the parable has. I want to read verses 1 through 8 first, so we get the context or the teaching or the parable, if you will, of what Jesus is talking about here. And he said also unto his disciples, there was a certain rich man which had a steward, and that same was accused unto him that he had wasted his goods. So we have a master there, and we have the steward. Again, the steward was in charge of the master's stuff to use it properly. Evidently, he wasn't doing what he was supposed to, the steward. And he called him and said unto him, how is it that I hear of this of thee? Give an account of thy stewardship, for thou mayest no longer a steward. So basically, the master is sitting there, I've heard that you've been wasting my goods. I want you to give an account to what you've done. Okay, if it's not satisfactory to me, you're out the door. Basically, the steward's getting fired here is what we're talking about. And then the steward said within himself, what shall I do? He realizes what's going to happen. For my Lord taketh away from me the stewardship. Notice this, I cannot dig. I can't do manual labor. How many people we've heard do that? I ain't going to work out in the sun. I can't do that. To beg, I am ashamed. I'm not going to beg for my sustenance like some people do. I am resolved what to do, that when I am put out of the stewardship, that they may receive me into their houses. Okay. So basically, he's making plans for when he is now taken out of that stewardship. He's looking to his future. What am I going to do? And he comes up with this plan so that they, and we'll see who the they here is in a minute, will receive me into their houses. I'm going to be out of a job. I don't want to work for my money. I don't want to beg for it. So I need somebody to take me in, basically, so that I can have sustenance. So he called every one of his Lord's debtors unto him and said unto the first, how much owest thou unto my Lord? And he said, 100 measures of oil. And he said unto him, take thy bill and sit down quickly and write 50. So basically, cut your bill in half. What's he doing for that debtor? You see what he's doing? He's making friends with that debtor. He's sitting there, you ever hear the terminology, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours? Yeah, that's what's happening. He's making plans for the future. So when he loses his stewardship, he can go to these people and they'll look at him and say, hey, you help me out, come on in. That's what he's doing. Then he said to another, and how much owest thou? And he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said unto him, take thy bill and write 80. Okay? He took a little bit more off of this guy's. This is only 40% now. And the Lord commended the unjust steward. And this is where the confusion really comes into play. Because he had done wisely. Okay? For the children of this world are in their generation wiser than children of light. Okay? Here's where the confusion of this parable comes in. They want to attribute the rich man or the master as being Jesus Christ. This is where we need to be careful when we start assigning titles or individuals to these people in these parables. Because in verse number 8, it would say the Lord commended the unjust steward because he had done wisely. The man just cut the bills in half. If this was the Lord, okay, was he now condoning sin? This is where the confusion gets in. We need to be careful in ascribing individuals to these parables. Jesus is using this as a time to teach, and he'll explain it here in the minute, on the right use of money. And he pulls from the world, those in the world, of a situation and where a person used his money in a way to secure his future. That's what Jesus is teaching on. We need to remember that. It doesn't mean that Jesus is the steward, that Jesus is the rich man. Okay. That would mean he would probably be condoning sin. Second thing that we need to understand when we go to this is we don't know exactly what this steward, when he cut these bills, was that just his commission? Was he just giving up his commission? Me personally, I kind of maybe think that because he only cut the bill in half. Okay? He might have been giving up his portion of the commission to that individual. So he was actually giving away his portion of it. The master would still get his. I mean, we're not told, we're not given enough information to make those determinations. So what we need to do when we look at these, in any of the parables, we need to come to an understanding of what is being taught. What is Jesus teaching on this? Quit trying to ascribe so many titles to things and getting everything so confused. What is Jesus teaching on? He explains it in verse number 9. This is what the teaching is. And I say unto you, make to yourselves friends of the man of righteousness, that when ye fail, they may receive you into everlasting habitation. That's the teaching. That's what we need to focus in on, not who's who and what's what. Okay? Verse number 8. It's interesting. He would say, for the children of this world, Worldly people is who he's talking about. Those who are outside of his body, those who are sinners, okay, are in their generation, notice this, wiser than the children of light. Why are those individuals wiser? We got the truth. We study the truth. We talked about it in Bible class this morning, didn't we not? How are they wiser? Well, in this attribute, sometimes they are wiser than the children of light. And this parable is to show an instance when the world is wiser than the children of light. The man was using, and I'm going to use it in the context that he was giving up his commission in order to secure his future. That would seem pretty wise. That seems pretty smart when you think about it. Okay? But what does the children of light do? We don't. Well, a lot of times we don't do that. And again, going back to verse number 9, which is what the teaching is. I say to you, make to yourselves friends of the man of righteousness. The man of unrighteousness is simply money. That stuff. Now, Jesus isn't stating that you need to be friends with money and that you need to hoard it up to yourself. A lot of people, when they look at things like this and making friends, that's what they think. That's not what Jesus is teaching. What Jesus is saying in our vernacular, we might put it this way, use your money in such a way as you make friends. Okay? That's basically what Jesus is teaching on. Use your money in such a way that while you're here upon the earth, you make friends. Yeah, that's what this individual in the parable was doing, right? He used his money to make friends, so in the future, he had a place to go. That's what Jesus is teaching on here. But notice what he goes on to say. That when you fail or when you die, okay, they. Who's the they in that word there? The they are the friends that you made when you were here upon the earth with your money. That's the friends. That's the they. Now notice what he says, that they may receive you where? Into everlasting habitations. What's he talking about? He's talking about the hereafter. Heavenly abode. That they, the friends that you made while here, may receive you when you die. Where are those individuals at? Where are those friends? They're in heaven. How did they get to heaven? They obeyed the gospel. When Jesus says, make to your... This is where a lot of Christians fail. This is why Jesus in verse number 8 would say the children of this world are wiser than the children of light. Because in a lot of instances, a lot of times, we as children of light here upon the earth do not use our money in such a way as to make friends that they can greet us in heaven when we die. We would rather use our money and our time and these things on things of the flesh. Now I want to be careful when I say this. Okay. There's a concept that each one of us needs to understand when it comes to our giving of our material possessions. And that is, do I need it or do I want it? Do I need it or do I want it? You think about, well, Apple's coming out with a new iPhone here in a couple months, okay? And you're going to have individuals that are going to be lined up, as they always do, every time Apple comes up with a new phone. Sitting outside, camping outside the Apple store so they can be the first one to get it. And all the time that they're camped out there, guess what they're doing? They're on their phone texting their friends. They're on their phone making calls. They're on their phones doing all the things that new phone's going to do for them. Do they need that phone? They don't need it. Why are they there to get it? Because they want it. They want to fulfill the lust of the flesh. That's where the difference is. You take a car, okay? I have experience with this in my life. You know, I used to have that old blue, the S10, and my wife can vouch for this. I had it for like 11 years. It was falling apart. Before I bought the truck I drive now, it took me about 3 months before I made a decision to buy that. I had to go to God in prayer. Do I really want to do that? I'm going to have to spend this money to get this truck. Do I really want to spend that money? It was something that was needful for me because the S10 was falling apart. Windshield wipers didn't work. The doors weren't staying closed. It was just starting to fall apart. Yeah, and when we have a situation like that, I mean, the second law of thermodynamics has taken place, the law of entropy, everything's falling apart. Am I going to be spending more money trying to keep that thing going than if I buy this new truck? I got to have it. My livelihood depends upon it. And so I went out and I had to buy it. It was a need. It was a need. That's where we get confused. We take our wants and we think they're needs. You know, back in the early 50s, I think statistics would bear this out in studies. Back then, there were like, you ask people of their needs at that time, they would say there's like 23 of them. 23 needs. It's what you absolutely need. Now, I'd probably argue that it's actually less, but 1950 they said 23. You know what it is today? It's over 100 that people think they need in order to survive. We don't need those things. We don't need to do those things. What do we need to do? We need to make friends with our money here upon the earth. That means using our money wisely in such a way as to bring people to God. That's the purpose of the church. I don't need to go out shopping every weekend to buy clothes. My wife will tell you. I'll wear a pair of jeans until they got holes in them, and she says, "You're throwing those away, buddy." Okay, honey, I guess I need a new pair of jeans. Okay. But a lot of people, a lot of Christians out there, they just simply go out and buy things because they want to fulfill the lust of the flesh. Because I want it. It makes me feel good. We need to understand the concept between want and need. Want and need. So finally, we have divine ownership. God has taken those things that He's owned and He has entrusted us to use them. And now we look at being faithful in how we use what God has given us. Not to fulfill the lust of my flesh, not to go out and buy those things that I want,